April 22nd, 1945, Camp Carson, Colorado. The sun crested over the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, casting long, skeletal shadows across the gravel yard where 16 German boys stood in a ragged, shivering line. Their breath misted in the biting morning air, a rhythmic white pulse that betrayed the frantic hammering of their hearts. These were not the granite-faced veterans of the Eastern Front, but children, some as young as 14, wearing oversized American surplus uniforms that hung off their narrow frames like funeral shrouds. Their hands trembled with a violent, uncontrollable energy, not from the high-altitude chill, but from the absolute, crushing certainty that this gravel lot was destined to be their final resting place. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary moment where the brutality of war collided with an unexpected spark of humanity, please take a moment to support the channel. Hit that subscribe button and give this video a like to help us keep these vital stories of our shared history alive for future generations. We would love to know where you are joining us from today, so please drop your country in the comments below. It is truly incredible to see how far these echoes of the past can reach. If your own family has a story from the front lines or the home front, share it with us. Your history is the heartbeat of this channel. The silence in the yard was heavy, pressing against the boys' ears with the weight of the mountains themselves. Guards emerged from the barracks, their faces unreadable masks of military discipline, their movements slow and deliberate. 14-year-old Eric Schneider watched them approach, his eyes stinging from the wind and the lack of sleep. He had been told by his officers back in Germany that the Americans were barbarians who executed children to save on rations. As the order to march was barked out in a language he barely understood, Eric felt a cold stone settle in his gut. He realized with terrifying clarity that he would never see his 15th birthday. To understand how a child from the Rhine ended up awaiting a perceived execution in the shadow of the Rockies, one must look at the desperate, crumbling architecture of the Third Reich in early 1945. By March of that year, the German military machine was no longer a juggernaut. It was a hollowed-out shell, fueled by fanaticism and the conscription of the last reserves. This was the era of the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, where grandfathers and schoolboys were handed Panzerfausts and told to stop the steel tide of the Western Allies. Eric had been one of them, swept up in the frantic defense near Aachen, a city that became a graveyard for German pride. The logistical disparity between the two warring nations was, by this stage, almost incomprehensible. While Germany struggled to manufacture enough synthetic fuel to move a single panzer division, the United States was operating on a scale of abundance that defied imagination. In 1944 alone, American factories had churned out over 96,000 aircraft, while German production lines were being turned into twisted scrap by relentless Allied bombing. For every gallon of fuel, a German commander rationed like liquid gold. The American supply chain pushed forward millions of barrels. This was a war of attrition where one side was starving and the other was overflowing. Eric's journey to Colorado had been a disorienting blur of steel and salt water. Captured after firing his rifle, exactly twice hitting nothing but the mud, he had been processed through a series of transit camps before being loaded onto a Liberty ship. He was one of over 425,000 German prisoners of war held on American soil across more than 500 camps. To the American public, these prisoners were a source of much-needed labor for farms and factories. To the boys like Eric, they were captives in a land of giants. They had been raised on a diet of Goebbels' propaganda, told that America was a degenerate, fractured society that would crumble under the weight of its own decadence. But as the train carried them west from the Atlantic coast, the propaganda began to fracture. Eric stared through the slats of the rail car at endless fields of grain, at cities untouched by fire, and at a landscape that seemed to go on forever without a single crater or ruins. It was a psychological shock that no training could prepare them for. By the time they arrived at Camp Carson, the boys were physically safe but mentally shattered. They were convinced that the kindness they had seen so far was a ruse, a tactical deception designed to lower their guard before the inevitable retribution for the crimes of their leaders. The march across the camp that April morning felt like a funeral procession. Boots crunched rhythmically against the gravel, the only sound in the vastness of the Colorado Basin. Eric walked in the center of the column, his eyes fixed on the frayed collar of the boy in front of him, trying to remember the scent of his mother's kitchen in Dusseldorf. He imagined the telegram reaching her, the clinical language informing her that her son had died in a land she couldn't find on a map. The column turned away from the main barracks, heading toward an isolated rectangular field bordered by distant coils of barbed wire. In the center of the field stood several wooden benches and a series of metal barrels. To a boy who had seen the aftermath of interrogations in occupied Europe, the setup looked suspiciously like a firing squad staging area. The guards gestured for the 16 boys to sit. They obeyed with a robotic, haunting compliance, their bodies rigid as they stared at the distant snow-capped peaks. Eric noticed a small utility shed nearby. He expected to see soldiers emerging with rifles, perhaps a priest or a blindfold. Instead, the guards returned carrying heavy wooden crates. The tension in the field was thick enough to choke on. One guard pried open a crate with a crowbar, the screech of metal on wood sounding like a scream in the stillness. Eric braced himself, but what emerged was not a weapon. It was a sack of flour. Then came jars of pickles, packages of ground meat kept cold in crates of ice, and onions that caught the morning light. Another guard wheeled forward a portable field kitchen, a hissing metal beast that began to radiate a soft, inviting heat. The boys exchanged glances of pure, unadulterated confusion. This was not the choreography of death they had rehearsed in their nightmares. The scent hit them first, a sharp, savory aroma that cut through the mountain air like a blade. It was the smell of searing beef, a luxury that had vanished from the German diet years ago. In 1945, the average German civilian was subsisting on roughly 1,200 calories a day, mostly consisting of watery soup and ersatz bread made with sawdust fillers. Here, in the middle of a prisoner-of-war camp, the Americans were laying out a feast of high-protein abundance. The guards began to flip thick patties on the griddle with the casual, practiced efficiency that suggested this was just another Tuesday for them. Then came the final touch of American surrealism. A guard reached into a tub of slushy ice and pulled out a glass bottle with the familiar red and white script, Coca-Cola. To Eric, that bottle was more than a drink. It was the ultimate symbol of the decadent West he had been taught to hate. Now it sat mere feet away, sweating beads of condensation in the sun. The guards didn't shout or mock them. They simply worked. They toasted soft white buns, bread so white and fluffy that looked like cake to the starving boys, and began to assemble what the Americans called hamburgers. For these 16 children, the world had flipped on its axis. They had been prepared for the cold bite of a bullet. They were given the warmth of a meal. A guard gestured for the first boy to stand and approach the table. One by one, they were handed a burger wrapped in wax paper and a chilled bottle of soda. When it was Eric's turn, his hand shook so violently he nearly dropped the bottle. The glass was impossibly cold, a stinging contrast to the radiating heat of the meat. He returned to his bench, staring at the food as if it were a hallucination that might vanish if he blinked. The first bite was a revelation that transcended politics or war. The juice of the meat, the crunch of the fresh onions, and the sweetness of the bun flooded Eric's senses. It was a sensory overload that brought tears to his eyes, though he fought to keep them from falling. He looked around and saw his comrades' children who had been hardened by the Hitler Youth and the horrors of the front weeping openly as they ate. The Americans stood back, leaning against their trucks, smoking cigarettes and watching with a neutral, almost bored expression. They weren't looking for gratitude. They were simply performing an act of casual, massive logistics. As Eric tilted the glass bottle back, the carbonation hissed against his tongue, a bright, stinging sweetness he had only ever read about. In that moment, the propaganda he had been fed his entire life dissolved. He realized that the barbarians from the West weren't just powerful because of their planes or tanks. They were powerful because they could afford to be kind. They had so much food, so much fuel, and so much wealth that they could give their enemies a feast before the morning was over. This was a psychological defeat more total than any battlefield loss. The meal lasted perhaps 20 minutes, but for Eric it felt like a lifetime. The fear that had defined his existence since his conscription began to evaporate, replaced by a complex, stinging shame and a burgeoning sense of hope. He realized that if the Americans were this generous with their food, perhaps they were equally generous with their mercy. The execution he had feared was a phantom, a product of a dying regime's lies. The reality was a quiet field in Colorado, and the taste of salt and grease on his lips. As the boys finished, the guards began to pack up the field kitchen with the same mechanical efficiency they had used to set it up. The empty bottles were collected, the crates were stacked, and the fire in the portable stove was extinguished. The field was returned to its natural silence, but the 16 boys sitting on the benches were no longer the same people who had marched out of the barracks an hour earlier. They stood up when signaled, their backs straighter, their eyes no longer darting toward the horizon in search of a grave. The march back to the compound was different. The rhythmic crunch of gravel now sounded like progress rather than a countdown. In the months that followed, the war in Europe reached its violent, inevitable conclusion. News reached Camp Carson of the fall of Berlin, the suicide of the Fuhrer, and the final, unconditional surrender of the Third Reich. For many of the older prisoners, this news was a catastrophe, the end of the world they had sworn to defend. But for Eric and the younger boys, it was a release. They had already seen the future in a Colorado field, and it was a future that didn't involve the scorched earth fanaticism of their leaders. The American authorities began the massive task of repatriating hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Eric was eventually processed for return in late 1945, crossing the Atlantic once more, but this time on a ship filled with men who were looking toward a reconstruction rather than a conquest. When he finally reached his home in Dusseldorf, he found a city of ruins and ghosts. His family had survived, but they were living in a cellar, scavenging for scraps in a landscape of gray ash. He never told them about the hamburger at Camp Carson. It felt like a dream that was too cruel to share with people who were boiling nettles for soup. As the years turned into decades, Erich built a life in the new West Germany. He became an engineer, married, and raised children who never knew the weight of a rifle or the sound of an air raid siren. The American presence in Germany changed from that of an occupier to an ally, and the symbols of that morning in Colorado, the golden arches and the red and white logos, became a permanent fixture of the German landscape. To his neighbors, a hamburger was just a quick meal, a symptom of globalization. To Erich, it was the taste of the day his life was given back to him. In the late 1990s, shortly before his passing, Erich spoke with a local historian gathering testimonies from the Flakhelfer generation, the child soldiers of the war. He spoke of the fear of the Russian advance, the cold of the bunkers, and the hunger that never seemed to leave his bones. But when he reached the part of his story set in Colorado, his voice slowed, and he described the scent of the griddle and the coldness of the Coca-Cola bottle with a clarity that seemed to bridge the 50-year gap. He admitted that he had never quite understood why the guards did it, whether it was a formal policy or a spontaneous act of mercy by a few bored his. Historians have since noted that such induction meals were sometimes used by American intelligence and psychological warfare units to break the ideological shell of young, fanatical prisoners. By showing them the sheer scale of American abundance and the lack of traditional enemy cruelty, they could often secure more cooperation during interrogations. But for the guards at Camp Carson, it may have been much simpler. They were men far from home, looking at a group of terrified children who reminded them of their own younger brothers. In the calculated machinery of total war, sometimes the human heart simply rebels against the script. Erich Schneider passed away in 2003, a man who had lived to see the world he was born into utterly destroyed and rebuilt. His story remains a testament to a specific fleeting kind of historical grace. It serves as a reminder that while wars are won with steel, oil, and the cold logic of production, the peace that follows is often built on much smaller foundations. It is built on the moments where the enemy is, say, the 16 boys of Camp Carson, lived because the world they were told to die for was a lie, and the world they were told to fear offered them a hand instead of a fist, raised on slogans and stripped of childhood. They had been taught that surrender meant disgrace, that mercy was weakness, and that their enemies were monsters waiting to destroy them. Instead, they encountered something far more destabilizing than violence: compassion. They realized they weren't just fighting a military. They were fighting a nation that had the luxury of being human, even in the heat of conflict. A nation so confident in its strength that it could afford restraint. The guards who handed them food did not lecture them. They did not mock them. They simply fed them, spoke softly, and let the silence do the work that years of indoctrination could not. The image of those boys sitting on wooden benches weeping over hamburgers under a wide American sky remains one of the most poignant scenes of the war's end, a moment where the hunger of the soul was fed as much as the hunger of the body. For the first time in years, no one was shouting. No one was demanding sacrifice. There were no flags, no slogans, no orders to obey. Just food, sunlight, and the terrifying realization that the world was not what they had been promised. Some of the boys cried openly. Others stared at their hands, unsure how to reconcile this moment with everything they had been taught to believe. A few ate in silence, slowly, as if afraid the meal might disappear if they moved too quickly. For many of them, it was the first time kindness had arrived without a price. The legacy of that morning is not found in history books or grand monuments, but in the quiet, lingering realization that kindness is the ultimate weapon of a free society. It is a force that can dismantle an ideology more effectively than 1,000 bombers. Bullets can end a battle. Mercy can end a belief. As Eric Schneider often thought in his final years, the Americans didn't just save his life that day. They saved his belief in humanity. Long after the uniforms were folded away and the camps dismantled, that belief stayed with him. It shaped how he raised his children, how he spoke of the past, and how he understood the meaning of victory. In a century defined by its darkness, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all. We hope this story resonated with you as much as it did with us. History is often summarized through maps and generals, yet it is these small, human moments that truly define who we were and who we might still become. If you enjoyed this journey back to 1945, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue bringing echoes of the past into the light. What other stories of humanity from the war should we cover next? Let us know in the comments. And until next time, remember this: even in the darkest hours, a single act of kindness can change the course of a life. When we see an enemy not as a target, but as a person in need,